Hey guys, welcome back to Honkai Star Rail. In today's video, we are checking out an updated tier list over on Pridewin, including Luocha and YuKong, and some changes to their list. I want to go through and talk about them. Now, as always, in this game, you can do absolutely everything you need to do with whatever you have. So this is just that realm that if you enjoy it, you can look at this stuff, but really you can play whatever you want. And as always, tier lists are always subjective, so take it with a massive grain of salt. And I wanted to talk about that at the start of this one because the way I see tier lists forming now is that we're shaping up into the later game, and I feel like we're looking at it a lot more from the whale's perspective. I spoke about this in a previous video, but a lot of players are getting to the point now where we're level 80. You got a lot better relics, your traces are up there, so your units are just in general a lot better. So I think in general what you'll see from this tier list is that we're moving away from a more double defensive unit team into single defensive unit being like a single healer or a single shielder, and then everything else being offense, and that's sort of the meta we're shifting to. So keeping in mind, if you are an earlier account or maybe a free-to-play player who hasn't had the progression as well as someone else, some of those more defensive units are still going to be a priority. Namely, we're talking about the Fire Trailblazer when we look at that, but I'm going to go through the whole list and explain it. But in general, I think that's where we're shifting to, is that the game is becoming more of a just... We're getting more offensive focused, and that was always going to be the evolution of the game. Is once you get the relics, you get the traces, you get the units, you can play much more offensively, and that's why you'll see with Luocha, or Locha, however you want to say it, being in the S+, he just allows that hyper offensive gameplay, whereas something like Bailu is still really strong, but not as strong when we look to the hyper offensive gameplay. So that's the kind of thing we're looking at. So let's go through, we'll go through the new characters first. Obviously, Locha, he's amazing. He just makes it really easy in the terms of like, he can just auto through, and the smart healing. That was always my big thing with him, is the smart healing. Once again, I personally don't see the need to pull for him on my accounts, and I will not be, because I like, even though he is currently quote unquote the best healer in the offensive situations, I still don't think he's like a must pull or anything like that. But because of the offensive pressure, the other thing that I've mentioned before is that he also provides not only damage, but also break. And especially when we're looking at Memory Chaos at the moment, there's a lot of imaginary. He has that coverage. He has 2 break units on his ultimate. He has obviously 1 break unit on his basic, but he's going to use his basic a lot because he has that smart healing. He's got the field. He's got some really good combos with things like Clara. He's going to have good combos with something like Blade in the future. So he's just looking really strong. And at the moment in that offensive gameplay, he is S+. Best healer in the game. Having said that, there is situations in which I think I would prefer Bailu if I'm not fully geared, level 80, all that sort of stuff, because sometimes that combat res can be super, super clutch in certain situations and can save you. But when you look to 3-starring stages and you're at that stage of being able to 3-star stages, then that's when Locha really does shine. Moving on from that, we have YuKong. Now, YuKong, I've had a lot of people ask me to make a video on YuKong. I've got her on 2 of my accounts. I just haven't been able to get the gear right. She's just a tricky unit to build, essentially, because of speed tuning. I want to build mine as a DPS. You can build it as a support or DPS. I'm just that guy that likes big numbers, so every character I can build as a DPS, like Silverwolf, I want to build as a DPS, so I haven't got YuKong sorted yet. Now, Pridewin have placed her at A. They've got a whole blog talking about where they place things, but essentially what they said, because they're that same thing, is that she is a tricky build. You got to really speed tune. You got to have the right set, like the right gear for her. So because of that, and also because they're considering only 4 stars at E2 in this list, that's why she is at A, but she could be put up. And once again, I'm sort of reserving my judgment on YuKong. I've seen a lot of things from people, but I really want to test her myself on a build that I want to use. So I've got to wait and see to give you guys my final personal judgment on YuKong. But essentially that's where they've put her. Now, let's just go through the tiers, and we'll talk about the changes in tiers as we go. Zila, still just Zila. Bronya and Silverwolf, the Bronya tier, obviously. Japad, still the best. So the thing with me is I'm not too sure on when we look at so the reasoning for the Fire Trailblazer going down is that we are in that offensive phase, so we don't need the Trailblazer as much. However, when I look to the Fire Trailblazer, I feel like it also has like a really good break potential, whereas Japard doesn't have that. But I think they're looking at Japard as a solo defensive option. And I don't know if Japard over Bailu as a solo defensive. I'm tipping a lot of endgame players are at the gear stage now where Japard is even better as a solo support, and basically to get that protection, you don't really need to do much, and then he has the freeze on board. So I guess that's why they're putting him there as a single unit defensive support better than Bailu, because I'm guessing they're seeing more situations in which it's just Japard over Bailu. I'm not 100% sure on that reasoning myself, to be honest. But yeah, in general, he is a beast. In my account, I find often just using Japard on my Japard account where I have Japard and Bailu, I do find him very, very powerful, especially once you got the gear, you got the energy regeneration, and he's maintaining that shield. And then once all your other characters also have really good gear, it means they've just got raw, better defensive stats, and they're killing stuff quicker, which means you don't need to refresh it as much. So that's my reasoning, trying to explain why Japard's there and Bailu isn't, because I have had people ask me that. Moving on from that, we got Clara. Now, Clara, the up arrow for Clara is in her AoE ranking because they're looking at her as hyper carry. So the interesting thing about Clara for me is she, before the game released, and like when I was chatting with dudes like Grimro and stuff like that, they were theory crafting her in simulations as like a crazy cracked DPS as a hyper carry. However, when we got into the real game, we realized that you couldn't just hyper carry like that with Clara because she took all the aggro and she would get clapped. So then they put her into the defensive support because you played her as a tank. Now she's back over into the DPS being used as a hyper carry, but she has really good synergies with things like Luocha. So Clara for me is one of those characters. And we could see this happen with the Fire Trailblazer, where we do more of a damage-based Fire Trailblazer with break builds and stuff like that. But Clara, if you're early on, I still build my Claras as tanks. Because if she's built as a DPS for me, with my account, where my account's at, she gets killed because she takes all the aggro and she gets one shot. So I feel like that S ranking as a DPS is sort of leaning on Luocha and really high gear levels. But I still think she's an S rank character. But the great thing about her is you can start her off as more of a tanking type units with more defensive stats. And then you can evolve her. Like you can have her as split between, some defensive, some offensive. And then once you get to that point that you need to, you can shift her into fully offensive. So she's a versatile unit that we can use along the way, but the way you use her changes depending on where you are in the game, if that makes sense. Then the other change, we've still got Jing and Yang Qing in the S tier, but the Welt has been moved from the offensive support into the damage dealing. I guess that's more semantics. It doesn't really matter. Like he has damage and he has support. So it's whichever one you want to look at him. But from what their blog was saying is that he's being built more on damaging sets. So even though he is the debuffer, he's being built as damage for that purpose. It's kind of like if you had E2 Silverwolf, you'd probably be looking at her in a damage dealing slot. But I guess her place is more like I don't know, because like I feel like Welt, I don't know if I haven't got him to test him, but I don't know if his damage is quite up there with Jing, Clara, and Yang Qing. He's just raw damage potential, but it's that combo of the debuffer plus the damage that puts him in that spot. So that's essentially, he's just shifted over there. We've got Pella and Ting there, and once again, Bailu went down because we've basically just aligned those tiers in terms of healers' priority. So Luocha, then Bailu, then Natasha when we're looking at Memory of Chaos and stuff like that in priorities. As we move on to the A tier, pretty standard. These units have been here for a while now. Keep in mind, this is looking at E2 for the 4 stars. That's pretty standard. I mean, you could argue for some changes everywhere in these bottom tiers, but I mean, I'm pretty cool with it. I think it's pretty fine. Asta, like I've mentioned before, I think Asta could quite easily go up, but it depends on the units you have. The thing for me is with Asta and YuKong, I definitely think they could both go up for people who have limited rosters, because those are both free units that are both really strong. Well, YuKong's not free yet, but she will be. But they also offer great break. And I've mentioned this before, where break is really important when you don't have everything at your disposal and you're limited on options and you're using a lot more skill points. And especially when YuKong can do really good break with her basic attack, it's not too bad. And then also her ultimate. So that's the kind of way I'm looking at those two. It depends on your roster on where you put these guys on a tier list. Then March, Natasha, and Fire Trailblazer being in that same tier. I've always thought March and Fire Trailblazer were actually fairly similar in usage for me on my free-to-play account and stuff like that, or my 4-star only account. It just depends on the situation in which one you bring. If you have to bring one as a solo tanking unit, they can both do it, but I honestly find March better as a solo tanking unit and Fire Trailblazer better as like a breaking, supportive, like offensive / defensive supportive type unit, if that makes some sense. But that is going to be the A tier. As we move down into B, Arlen has moved up into B with Sampo. There's people seeing a lot more use of him, even though his numbers are still, relatively low. He does have that 0 skill cost, so he does have the efficiencies. So people are more prioritizing him now that people have started building him again. I really want to build Arlen. The problem is on my 4-star only account, I'm building YuKong at the moment. She's above level 70 now, so I'm trying to finish off her, and then I'll move on to the Arlen. And then we've got Herta being moved out of her own D tier into the C tier with the physical Trailblazer. Honestly, I feel like this whole from A down is just a massive gray area for me in the DPS units. It's just a massive gray area, and it's hard to pick. I can sort of see why Sampo and Arlen get put down here because they have counterparts up there, even though they're different roles. You can argue that, you're trying to choose a lightning or a wind unit, even though, Sampo's got the AoE and he's more of a dot-based unit, then Dan is more of a, single target unit. We've got AoE with Survival versus Arlen's Bruiser type mechanics. So they are different, but I can see the justification for it. Same with Physical Trailblazer, because you got Su Shang, and if you got Su Shang, it's hard to justify Physical Trailblazer. But Herta for me, after using her, and I'm still farming gear for her, I've spent like 2 weeks farming gear for Herta, and I have not got a single good ice set piece. I got some pretty good wind ones, but no good ice ones. So I'm waiting to get my Herta geared, and we'll do another Herta video. But I honestly think Herta could easily jump up to B, almost even into the A tier, especially in the Memory of Chaos with where we're looking, because there is so many units that, like enemies now, that spawn regular ads that she absolutely slaps. And if you have a really well built Herta, she is actually really solid for me, in my opinion. Once again, as I test units, I always get a better feeling for them and I rate them higher myself. But yeah, Herta's one I was thoroughly impressed with when I built her. But that is pretty much where the tier list is at. Like I said, I pretty much agree with most of this. I think it's a big gray area down the bottom here. But in general, like I said, just keep in mind that this is looking more at that more offensive type of gameplay, because players are getting further, level 80, better gear, better traces, everything like that. Everything's just getting ironed out a lot more, and people have a lot more to play with, so you can go those hyper offensive routes. But keep in mind, if you are still earlier on, you don't have great gear and stuff like that, you will get, like, you would probably rate something like the Fire Trailblazer higher into the S tier, because you probably find that you really get saved by it a lot. So that is what we're looking at, but that is the current tier list over on Pridewin. Once again, I'll leave it linked in the description. Massive shout out to Pridewin as always. And once again, a massive shout out to you guys for watching. Thanks as always, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one. Cheers.